Thank you, Shelley. Well, it's so good to see you and so great to be at Keystone. God bless you. You may be seated. 1620, a group of bold, courageous, and adventuresome Europeans landed on what is now the east coast of the state of Massachusetts. We call them the Pilgrims. The first winter, about half of them died from diseases and starvation. And those that were remaining, they thought it would be better, but it wasn't. And they were facing the same kind of malady that those who had died faced. In desperation, as they looked at the food supply, they planted Indian corn, and the drought and the heat and no rain had left it parched. They looked at that, and they faced what was called later by them the starving time. And in that situation, their leader called for them to engage God in prayer. And Governor William Bradford said that after that solemn time of humiliation and earnest prayer, it wasn't long before the skies began to bring rain. And as you read his original proclamation, you'll be impressed with the language that he used and the way he spelled the word rain, R-A-I-N-E. But he described how that the rain came without violence, without wind, and without thunder, and without lightning. It was just a rain. And as a result of that, the harvest produced. And they had wheat, and they had peas, and they had squash, and all kinds of different vegetables. And he says that the forest produced bounties of game, and the seas bounties of fish and clams. And as a result of that, they proclaimed, he did, in the third year after that they had landed, the year 1623, November 29, that he would proclaim it a day of thanksgiving. This Thursday, we're going to celebrate Thanksgiving. And that's a good thing to do. It's a great thing to do. And I believe that it is appropriate that we respond to God for the bounty of his blessings. And this Thursday, you'll gather around and probably have some great food and maybe eat a lot of it, maybe too much, some of us. And it'll be a time of thanksgiving. But I want to talk to us about developing a thankful heart that we live with day in and day out as a way of life and not just a day. I celebrate the day, but I want to challenge you and me today to embrace a heart of thankfulness and build in our lives an ongoing attitude of gratitude. You listen to motivational speakers, and you listen to read blogs and podcasts and authors, and what you hear them say, that an attitude of gratitude, a thankful heart, is good for you. It's something that we all need, a thankful heart. So I decided that rather than just listening to the bloggers and reading the bloggers and listening to the podcast, I would do a little research and see if there are real scientific benefits to an attitude of gratitude. And here's what I found out in Psychology Today. I found out that there are scientific benefits from an attitude of gratitude. Here's what I found out. I found out that gratitude opens the door to more relationships. A simple thank you can open the door to a relationship that will be meaningful in your life. Gratitude, they said, improves physical health. My sister-in-law, my wife's sister, went through a very challenging time physically, and they talked to her about her attitude. She had a great attitude, and it helped her physically during that time. Gratitude improves psychological health. Here's one that I really like. Gratitude enhances sensitivity and less aggression when dealing with people. I thought about, in the context of our present culture, we need some toning down of the aggressiveness and the aggression. And maybe if we had a heart that was more thankful, that led to an attitude that was more positive, we wouldn't get on the railroad of negativism and always be aggressive in our communications and what we had to say about one another. I just, for one, think at this particular time that we need less aggression in our relationships. Gratitude would help a lot. Gratitude improves sleep, being able to lay down with a grateful heart, an attitude of gratitude. Gratitude improves self-esteem, and gratitude improves mental health. When I read these things, I thought to myself, here's what I want to do. I want to be consistently and consciously constructing an attitude of gratitude. It seems that God has built it into the economy of the human spirit and the human life that if we have an attitude of gratitude, it does good things for us. It makes life better. It makes life more meaningful. It just elevates our experience. And so I say, I think we should consciously, consistently be in construction of an attitude of gratitude. Speaking of construction, by the way, as I prepared the message and I developed that particular thought in my mind, in my heart, I thought of you, Keystone Church. You've been in a constant and consistent attitude of construction, right? You've laid down some serious building blocks to your future. You've laid down the building block of a vision, a dream that's been shared, and Brandon shared it with you many times over. A building block of a dream, a building block of a plan, the plan that you have to build this house. The building block of finances that you've responded to. And Brandon said that last week it was monumental and a marquee moment in the history of Keystone Church. You've responded well with bringing your resources and you're making your commitments. You've laid down some serious building blocks to your future, and I want to say I join you in celebrating what God is doing with those building blocks and praying that day will be soon and very soon that you'll be in that building. Can you receive that? Well, we're going to talk to you about building blocks for a building. I want to talk about building blocks toward an attitude of gratitude. One of my favorite characters in the Old Testament is David. David the king. When you go to Israel, it's still called the city, Jerusalem is the city of David. Two great monumental people in the history of the nation Israel, Moses and David. Great, great leaders, Moses and David. David was king. David was a worshiper. David was a warrior. David was a person who knew great success and he knew great failure. He was a person who was able to do the right things and who did the wrong things. David knew about the rigors of life. But through all of that and out of all of that, David developed an attitude and a heart of gratitude. I'm going to reference Psalm 103 in just a moment, but let me just say as I work my way through that psalm, the psalmist David, he doesn't mention in this psalm thanksgiving. He does in others, but he doesn't in this one. He doesn't even speak of gratitude. But when you read the whole psalm, you cannot miss that it reeks with an attitude of gratitude. And David's laying down some serious things and some great big building blocks that will make it possible for you and me to take hold of them and walk out of here with an attitude of gratitude. Psalm 103 is the psalm that I reference, and they're going to put the words on the screen. You can follow along as I read them aloud. Psalm 103, David began, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquities, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from destruction, who crowns you with loving kindness and tender mercies, who satisfies your mouth with good things, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. Verse 19. By the way, verses 6 through 18 is an elaboration of what he said in verses 3 through 5. Verse 19, he concludes and he says, the Lord has established his throne in heaven, and his kingdom rules over all. And he concludes in verse 22 the way he began in verse 1. Bless the Lord, O my soul. When you read this psalm, there's something that you notice. Number one, that there's no word of complaint in the whole psalm. David's not complaining about all of the maladies of his life and the ups and downs of his life and the rigors of his life. He's not complaining. And there's not a word of selfishness in the psalm. But when you read the whole psalm, you just know that from the very heart and the being of David, he is expressing an attitude of thankfulness, a heart of gratitude. He begins with the word bless. Bless the Lord. Bless, bless, bless. It was interesting to me to look at this word and do some research about the very word bless. The word bless, one scholar made this comment about it, and I embraced it immediately. He says, when God blesses us, God reviews our needs and responds to them. When God blesses you and me, he reviews our needs and responds to them. But when we bless God, when man blesses God, man reviews God's excellencies and responds to them. David began and he ended with the word bless. Bless the Lord, O my soul. What is he doing? He is reviewing the excellencies of God. And as you unfold this psalm, what you will see is David is reviewing and responding to the excellencies of God. And as he does, he is filled with an attitude, a disposition reflected in the words that he used and the points that he makes that reflects, David would say, I have a heart of gratitude. God has been good to me. And in this, there are building blocks to an attitude of gratitude. Building block number one is who God is. Who God is. David said, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Now, when David used that phrase, holy name, David knew what he was doing. He was referencing the very name of God. What is God's name? How is it excellent? What does it reflect? Well, to get the answer to that, we go to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3, and we're in there, we recognize that the very people of God are in very difficult situations. The three patriarchs, the triage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob, by a strange turn of events and sequence of events, he winds up with his sons, his tribes, his families in the land of Egypt. For a period of time, it goes well, but things turn. Things turn. And there is an Egyptian king, Pharaoh, who looked at the economic landscape and he said, hey, I need some more manpower. So what he did, he took all the Jewish people, the Israelites, and he made them slaves in the land of Egypt. And in that slavery, they became a critical component to his whole economic platform. And for years, they were like that. There was a guy, a boy, that was born to Jewish people. And again, by strange turn of events, maybe providence, he winds up in the home of Pharaoh. He's being raised as an Egyptian. He's a Jew, raised as an Egyptian. But his mother ended up being his nursemaid. And no doubt she taught him not only the ways of her life, but the ways of God in her life. And so Moses grew up a Jewish man, knowing about God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and growing up as an Egyptian. One day, he was walking around and he saw an Egyptian guy brutally beating a Jewish person. The anger flew up in him. The sense of righteousness, what was right, rose up in him. And rather than responding to it in a good way, he responded to it in a bad way. And he killed the Egyptian, buried him in the sand, but realized later that he was about to be exposed, and he fled Egypt. And he went to a place called Midian, the great Sinai Peninsula. He went to a place called Midian, and there he met a Midianite priest named Jethro. And Jethro had a daughter. Her name was Zipporah. And so Moses married Zipporah and settled down in the land of Midian. One day, he was tending his father's sheep, and he was on a mountainside. And on that mountainside with his father's sheep, there was a voice that came out of a bush that was burning and spoke to him. I want to tell you, if that happened to me, I've been scared to death. And so would you. That voice, you can imagine what it was like. But it got Moses' attention. And it was the voice of God, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, speaking to Moses on that burning bush. And here's what God said. God said, I've looked down in the land of Egypt, and I've seen the misery of my people. I've heard the cries of my people. And I've made a decision. They're not going to stay there any longer. I'm going to lead them out of Egypt. Moses is saying in that moment, yea, God, I'm with you. I think they ought to be delivered. Yes, yes. Do it, God. Do it, God. Do it, God. Moses then heard God say, no, you're going to do it. What? Yeah, you're going to do it. So Moses fast winds in his mind a scenario, and that scenario says, then if I go and I tell them that I've come, how do I tell them who do I say sent me? And God said, you tell them that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob has sent you. He said, okay, now I'm talking to a more astute group, and they're saying, well, you tell me what that name is. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've heard about that in the far distant past, but I want to know the name of the person that sent you down here with the kind of authority that you say you have. And God said, you tell them, I am has sent you. Tell them, I am. Tell them that I am who I am. I am who I've been. I am who I am. I am who I will be. You tell them that I am who did what I did, sent you. You tell them that I am who will do what I intend to do right now, has sent you. You tell them that I am who will do what I intend to do in the future, has sent you. You tell them the great I am sent you. My name is I am. I am. Think about that. In a comprehensive, panoramic presentation, God says, this is who I am. I am. And here's the thing. David referred to that. You know why? Because he had gotten to know the great I am. In the rigors of life, in the successes of life, in the struggles of life. David had gotten to know not only about the great I am, He had gotten to know the great I am. He had gotten to know the great I am intimately. He had gotten to know the great I am experientially. He got to know who God is. Who God is. A high view of God will result in high gratitude. A low view of God will result in little gratitude. David had a high view of God. How do we get there? There are two dimensions by which you and I get to know God. There's a rational dimension and there's a relational dimension. In the rational dimension, we learn about God. We're taught about God. We read about God. And we learn about God. That is the rational dimension. And it is important. It is very, very, very important. We should never minimize it. But the rational dimension without the relational dimension, it gets you just halfway there. You can have a distorted view of God if all you got is a rational view. We need a relational view because our God is a relational God. We know God in the experiences of life. We know God in the ups and downs of life. We know God in the plane of living. And as we do, we begin to experience the God who was, and the God who is, and the God who will be, and the God who has acted, and the God who is acting, and the God who will be acting. We get to know God like that. And suddenly life is not bound up and we're not victimized by circumstances. Rather than that, we're elevated above circumstances because we are tethered to the great I am. Think about that. And you get that settled in your heart, it is a building block of gratitude. Building block number one, who God is. Building block number two is what God has done. What God has done. Here's something that's very important. We must refuse to forget. We must refuse to forget, or we will forget what God has done. We must refuse to forget, or we will forget what God has done. We'll be like the children of Israel. God brought them up out of the land of Egypt. He gave them a governance through Moses, their leader. It's called the law. The law is their constitution. It's their legal system. How to live and how to live well. The law was not given so that they might be bound up and not experience life. The law was given by God as a good thing so that they would have a governance by which they could live a good life. He gave them a law that showed them how that they could encounter Him and express themselves to Him and experience life with Him. He did good. He gave them leaders. He was long standing in that. But here's what happened to the nation of Israel. They got caught up in forgetfulness. They forgot. They forgot all that God had done, and they became grumbling, griping, negative people. Rather than enjoying and abounding in the goodness of God, they began to look around. And they looked around. And they looked around. And they began to gripe about what they did not have, not celebrate what they did have. And it became so bad, God raised up a prophet by the name of Isaiah. And he said, Isaiah, I want you to go speak to my people. And I want you to bring all of heaven in as a witness. And here's what God said to them. I've nourished and brought up children. This is moving. This is heartbreaking. And they've rebelled against me. Not a parent in this room that could not relate to the heartbreak of a rebellious child. They rebelled against me. Why did they rebel? They forgot. They forgot. And he says, here's what's happened. The ox knows its owner. You ever heard the expression, dumb as an ox? The ox knows its owner. And the donkey, these are not two premier animals. You understand? I mean, how'd you like to be compared to a donkey and an ox? That's not cool. And he says, the ox knows its owner, and the donkey knows its master's crib. But Israel does not know. My people do not have me and what I've done on their mind. They don't consider. Ingratitude developed because they forgot. Bad memory. Out of sight, out of mind. Living life. David said, I'm not going to be like that. He determined, not me. I'm not falling into that. And here's what he said. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. Forget not. I had this sermon way down, and it was all good and laid out, and I thought it was great. I called our youngest son, who is a Hebrew scholar, and I wanted to ask him about a couple of phrases. When I got off the phone, I was depressed because my sermon was completely destroyed. I wanted to turn it and make it remember. He said, Dad, and I understand the language, and I understand what it meant. It's a prohibitive imperative. It's a prohibitive imperative. That means that David summoned everything in him. His whole life, his whole inner being, his intellect, his emotion, his spirit, his whole body. Summoned all of it, and he said, here's the mandate I'm placing on my life. I refuse to forget what God has done. Wow! If we don't refuse to forget, we will forget. He's reviewing the excellencies of God, and he says, I refuse to forget the excellencies of God. And then David lists them. Verses 3 through 5, he lists them. Forgiveness, forgiveness. And between the services, someone said to me, that benefits, you know, the good things, the benefits, the blessings. And he enumerates, and he begins with the blessing of forgiveness. And they said to me, David needed a lot of forgiveness, didn't he? You know, we romanticize and miss the real if we're not careful. David did some horrible things in his life. Horrible things. Horrible things. It would disqualify him from being on this platform from where I am today in the eyes of many people. It would disqualify him for God ever using him in any way. It a lot of disqualifying things that David did. He needed forgiveness. But listen to what he says in this psalm. David said, as far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us. You know how far it is from the east to the west? That's infinity. That's infinity. He said he's taken my transgressions and he's thrown them into infinity to remember them against me no more forever. Forgiveness. What's God done? Forgiven. What's God done? He's healed. He healed David. He'll heal all of us someday. He healed. Listen to what David said. He described it. He went through them. He gave me life. I was going down into the pit of destruction. I was going down into the grave. I was going into the depths of despondency and despair and death, and God rescued me. He said, I've experienced the love and the mercy of God. I've experienced it. I've experienced the good things of life from God. And I've experienced God reaching down and giving me vitality when I had no vigor at all. I've experienced this. In other words, David is saying, I've experienced these good things from God. How do I personalize that? Can I just be personal for a moment? I personalize this. I want to build an attitude of gratitude that keeps me out of the maelstrom of negativism. Negativism drains your energy. It pulls you down. It gives you a bad attitude. And you see everything through a lens that is a lens of negative desperation. And it is fostered in our culture. God comes against that and says, that's not good for you. That's not best for you. I want you to look at life through the lens of my provision to you and what I've done for you and what I've given to you. And so I decided if I'm going to have a building block and have an attitude of gratitude all the time, and I'm going to live on that plane of thankfulness, I decided that I needed probably just in my own heart, in my own way. It's not little, it's a big deal. So sometimes preachers say things they shouldn't say, even while they're preaching. So I shouldn't have said a little thing. It's a big deal. And so I decided I'd think through the things for which I'm grateful. I'd look and see what God has done. And I'd look and see the hand and the mercy and the grace and the goodness of God in my own life. And it began with forgiveness. Forgiveness. We all need forgiveness. And I looked, and because I stepped across the line of faith one day, gave my heart and my life to Jesus Christ, He forgave me. That means my guilt is gone. It is gone. It is gone. It is gone. My shame, I don't have to drape the blanket of shame across my head and walk around with a red mark on my life, the mark of shame. I don't have to do that. You know why I don't have to do that? Because I've been forgiven. God is taking care of it. God's taking care of it. And if He's taking care of it, everybody else has to deal with it. I've been forgiven. Think about this. I thought about my wife. Some of you look at Jen, you say, Claude must have been really a sharp young man to get her. No, I wasn't. I worked hard at it, but I wasn't so sharp. She's a gift. She's a blessing from the hand of God. I look at our family. I say, look what God's done. I'm standing here today. This is where Brandon and Susan pastor and preach. When those boys were born, I had no idea that I'd be standing where they stand and preach where they preach. How would I ever think about that? I think about our whole family, their wives and our grandchildren. I think about this. I got food on my table. A lot of people don't. I got food on my table. I got a coat on my back. I've got shoes on my feet and got a little bit of money in my pocket. That's God. I'm in reasonable health. That's God. I'm able to think most days. That's God. Hey, what about you? What's God done in your life? You see, when we refuse to forget what God has done in our life, when we refuse to forget what God has done in our life, it will engender within us a building block toward an attitude of gratitude that we'll live with every day. Building block number one, who God is. Building block number two, what God has done. Building block number three. Y'all just hang on, because I really get excited right here. It's that God rules. That God rules. Now you say, Claude, why is that important? Verse 19 says that God rules over all. His throne's in the heaven, and His kingdom rules over all. He rules over all. Because God rules, His rule assures His reliability. His rule assures His reliability. We'll say it one more time. His rule assures His reliability. That's important because His reliability assures His promises. His reliability assures His promises. And His promises give us hope. His promises give us hope. And hope gives us life. Hope gives us life. Years ago, I was doing in a leadership lesson, and I prepared for it, and I read a whole section on hope. On hope. Leaders have to be looking into the future, seeing where's the hope. Leaders have to be willing to instill hope in people. Well, the greatest leader who's ever lived is Jesus, and Jesus made radical promises, and those promises are reliably true, and they give us hope. And here's what hope gives. Hope gives life. I said in the leadership, when there's no hope in the future, there's no power in the present. But I want to say to you today, because God rules, there is hope in the future that gives us life in the present. God rules. I want that building block in my life. I refuse to forget. Dr. Jerome Krugman, a distinguished professor at Harvard Medical School, studied the power of hope in medicine. Listen to what he said. He said, all my patients, hope, true hope, has proved as important as any medication I might prescribe or any procedure I might perform. That's the power of hope in life. And if there's one thing that's crystal clear, if there's one crystal clear promise in the Bible, it is this: we can always put our hope in God. Always. The psalmist over and again will say, put your hope in God. Paul, a person who had been he'd experienced just about everything. The good, the bad, and the ugly of life. He'd experienced it all. In Romans chapter 5, verse 5, he said this: when you got your hope in God, you will not be disappointed. Think about that. Hope. Why do I have that hope? Because God rules. And it gives me a different way of looking at things. German statesman Konrad Adenauer said, we all live under the same sky. We all live under the same sky, but we don't all have the same horizon. Everyone has the potential to possess a vision. Everyone in this room. A vision is not just for people who are in leading organizations or CEOs of companies. A vision for your life is something that everybody in this room can have. It's a vision that God can give for our lives. But not everyone does. It's a function, he says, of perspective. Now I want to give you a perspective to build an attitude of gratitude that will take your life to another level. Here it is. God rules. God rules. God rules. God rules. Here are 4 things that are absolutely overwhelmingly powerful. And if we tether this reality to our hearts, that God rules, it will produce something in our lives. I'm going to give you 4 things this means to you today. It means this: that nothing will ever happen to you that God doesn't know about. God knew about your life before you breathed your first breath. He knew about your life when you were being shaped in your mother's womb. And there's not anything that's going to happen to you or to me that God doesn't know about. He's not oblivious. He's not run away. He's not really teasing us by His absenteeism. He's not absent. He's not absent. He doesn't take a break. He's with us in everything, and God knows everything. Not anything you experience that God doesn't know about. Number 2, nothing will ever happen to you you cannot handle by God's grace. The Apostle Paul went through everything, as I said a moment ago. He experienced it all, but he experienced something that was a real, like a stake in his side. It's called a thorn in the flesh commonly, but it's not a thorn like a little bitty briar. It's not something like that. It was something like a stake had been driven into his side. So he went to the Lord and he said, Lord, will you remove this from me? And the Lord said, no. He went back a second time and said, Lord, will you take this away from me? And the Lord said, no. He went back the third time and he said, Lord, come on now. Take this out. It's really bad. And the Lord said, no. But I'm going to tell you something, Paul. My grace is greater than your problem. My grace is greater than your problem. And in your weakened state, you're going to be stronger than you've ever been because of my grace. Let me tell you, there's not anything great success. Great success. We have to handle success as well as failure, do we not? We have to handle it. A friend of mine wrote a book. Book sold tens of millions of copies, and we were together, and he said, we were talking about it, and he said, you know, with that book has come great affluence. Well, we all knew that. I mean, really. You don't sell tens of millions of books without getting tens of millions of dollars. And he said, the affluence is not an issue to me, but it's also brought great influence. And I want you to pray over me that I know how to handle this influence. And so we set him down in a chair and gathered around and put our hands on him and prayed that God would give him the grace to deal with his success. And God has. God has. The grace for success, the grace for troubled times, struggling times, grace. Good times, grace. Bad times, grace. Grace is God doing for us what we cannot ever do for ourselves so we can live the life that God has intended for us to live. Grace. There's not anything that happens that you cannot handle by God's grace. Nothing will ever happen to you without God's presence. He will not leave you. He will never leave you. Never, ever, 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 ever. That line in the song, he doesn't tease us, you know, like he's gone. No, he doesn't. He's always present. He's the great I am. That means I'm always present. And number 4, nothing, listen to this, listen, don't miss this. If they're on the screen, yeah, you need to get this. Nothing will ever happen to you that will not eventually be used by God for some good purpose in your life. Maybe you've done something that's not good. Maybe somebody's done something to you that's not good. Maybe you've been caught in the winds of an unfavorable circumstance and it's not good. Maybe you've been buoyed up in circumstance that is good. But whatever it is, God will take it. And we can see that when it's going good, but what about when it's going bad, Claude? Here's what I want to tell you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Well, what about when I've moved outside of the rule of God? Don't I have to stay right there? Don't I have to be perfect? No, you don't. Here's what I'll tell you. God is able and he is committed to those who have stepped across that line of faith and come into a relationship with him. God is committed to take the good, the bad, the ugly, in the real and the raw of life, put it in his heavenly blender like we put things we wouldn't eat by themselves in a blender and put them all in there, and we churn it up, and then we pour it out and we drink it. We say, oh, man, that's great. Let me tell you, that's what God does in our lives. And he can do it because he rules. And he will do it because he wants to bless us. Helpful hints to conclude the message. Our God oversees our world and He rules. Here's some action steps to take. Focus on knowing God through reading His Word. Here you learn about Him, but you can also experience Him at the point of His Word. The reason we say that this is a living Word is because God is active in His Word. And so I'm reading His Word, and it's as though God reaches out of His Word and whispers in my ear. Sometimes God reaches out of His Word and calls me just to lay down in His lap. Sometimes God reaches out of His Word and says, here, put your ear to my chest. I want you to know my heart's beating for you. And sometimes He says, I want you just to be real, real close. And it comes out of His Word. You learn about God and you learn to live with God by focusing on God and living life with Him, knowing God. Forget not. I refuse to forget. Forget not His benefits. Make a list of the past blessings. If you've never made a list, my wife every morning, almost without exception, she has her list. We have a devotion and she'll write stuff down. Could I suggest to you, it's a good idea to make a list of God's blessings and make a list of His daily blessings. And finally, trust God rules. Trust Him. Trust God. Because of who He is. Because of what He's done. And because He rules. Trust Him. Trust Him. And if we'll just take those three action steps, these building blocks, we'll build an attitude of gratitude that will swell up within us and cause us to say with David, to say with the angels, to say with the heavenly host, and to say with all of God's creation. All of us in symphonic, we say, bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless your holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all His benefits. Lord, we've reviewed your excellencies, and we respond with hearts filled with gratitude for your goodness, your grace in our lives. Let's pray. If you're here this morning, you never stepped across that line of faith, put your trust in Jesus to remove the barrier of your sins and connect you intimately, personally with the great I Am, will you do it right where you're seated? And all you need to do is just acknowledge, Lord, I've created the barrier by my own sin. And I know you paid the price and the penalty to remove that sin as far as east is from the west. And right now, Lord, I put my trust in you, Jesus, and all that you've done so that I might have that relationship with you, eternal God. I'm doing it right now. If you'll do that, here's what will happen. Your sins will be forgiven. The barrier will be removed. A bridge to the Father will be built, and you can take your step across that bridge into His presence right now. Right now. And as a believer, you're here. I want those building blocks in my life. Claude, I want those building blocks. Who God is. I want a high view of God, who God is. What God has done in my life. And I want Him to be the one who is the overruling, overarching authority and activity in my life. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Let's give Dr. Thomas.